Thank you very much. First of all, to the organizers, to the Colombians, the LSE, the Association of Colombian Students, for the invitation, to Professor Jean-Paul for supporting them. Very glad to see so many friends here. Very surprised to see my dear friends Antonio Celia and Patricia, his wife. And all of you, thank you very much for coming. There are many ways to look at a peace process, especially one as long as difficult as ours. A negotiation that lasted almost 5 years, as most of you know, to end a 50-year war. You can look at the strategic decisions that made the negotiation possible and brought it to a happy end. You can look at particular obstacles and issues, like, for example, the great issue of justice and peace. But today, I want to start by reminding us of the simple fact that a peace process, above all, is a political process. And today, I want to talk about the politics of peace. First, because I think that the future of the peace process hangs more than anything on which way this politics will go. And also, and secondly, because there are particular problems associated with doing a peace process in a democracy, or, as some experts like to say, in a conflicted democracy. So let me dive straight in and talk about what I think are 4 paradoxes or problems associated with the relation between peace and politics, and in particular between peace and democracy. Now, certainly, most of us believe that a well-functioning democracy is the best mechanism to channel conflict and to consolidate the peace. And that was, in fact, the objective of the whole peace process. To have a more robust and more inclusive democracy in Colombia, in particular one that extends to the millions of citizens that live in the periphery of Colombia, that suffered at close range the conflict, and for whom all too often the word democracy does not mean very much. But on the way there to this large aim, there were a number of problems that I want to address today. The first I will call the problem of acknowledgement. As some lucid commentators in Northern Ireland have pointed out, democracies have particular difficulty in acknowledging they have a conflict in their own territory. It contradicts their own self-understanding. And certainly there are gray areas, there are different degrees of conflict. Certainly also certain countries can choose for political or strategic reasons not to acknowledge they have a conflict, as was perhaps the case in Northern Ireland, at least towards the end, and in the Basque Country, and to opt for a response that is purely a law enforcement response in terms of security. And it's also true, in fact, that in any case, there is always a tension between, when you have an internal armed conflict, between what I will call the vertical dimension of the rule of law, of you as a state, as a government responding and protecting your own citizens and their rights, and the vertical dimension of a conflict. But I think in the case of Colombia, there is no ambiguity. There is no doubt we had an internal armed conflict. We have today still an army that is twice the size of the British Army, that was running major military operations under international humanitarian law, that was, in the case of the Air Force, launching major operations and bombing our own territory. And as a result of this conflict with the FARC, we have over 7 million internally displaced people. So there's no question that in Colombia we had an internal armed conflict. And yet, The problem is that the political opposition during the peace process, and in particular former President Uribe, vehemently denied that in Colombia there was an internal armed conflict. And if you deny there is an armed conflict, then you actually deny the possibility of a transition. And if you deny the possibility of the transition, you no longer have a framework to end the conflict with. You can no longer justify why you have political negotiations, not even why you're going to use a particular legal framework. It's not the only one, but it's the main one, which is international humanitarian law, or why you also need to have what I would call a strategic framework, which implies acknowledging that there is more going on than the fighting, and that there are other issues you need to address if you're actually going to end the conflict for good. And above all, if you deny this horizontal dimension, then there's no room to have a discussion with dignity with the other side. And in my view, if there's no dignity, there's no negotiation that is possible. So the first thing that President Santos did in 2010, or practically the first thing, was to do the obvious, to acknowledge that in Colombia there was an internal armed conflict. And the way this was done was through, as some of you may know, through a law, through the victims' law, which was defined in terms of precisely the victims of those who had participated in the internal armed conflict. Based on that acknowledgement, we built a new narrative for this negotiation, a more, I think, more precise narrative, which was precisely that, to say this negotiation is not about peace in general, this negotiation is about ending the conflict. And with that we signaled that this time around both sides were serious about ending the fighting, that this had to end with disarmament. We also, with this narrative, justified the fact that we had to include other issues on the agenda above and beyond the FARC's disarmament, because to end the armed conflict, there had to be certain things that needed to be done to consolidate the peace, and that's why we had the 5 issues you may know about on the agenda: the rural development, the political participation, the issue on drugs, victims and security/DDR. And also, with this narrative, we also sent a signal to Colombians that we fully understood that we were not making peace in Havana, we were ending the conflict, and that peace was something that had to be built by Colombians in Colombia afterwards. Now the question is, why would the opposition, and in particular President Uribe, why want to deny something so obvious as that there is an armed conflict? And I think it was actually for 2 reasons, which I may expand later on. The first, as I have said at other occasions, is simply that in a democracy, all too often, politics trumps peace. And former President Uribe simply decided to oppose the peace process because it was President Santos' peace process, and he could use that, his opposition to the peace process, to build a platform to get back into power, which is what he did successfully. But that's not the only reason. There's a second reason, I think, as well, and that is that if you deny there is a conflict, and if you deny this, what I call horizontal dimension, and you see all things vertically, then in a way you also deny that there might be some responsibility on your own side as well. That's what I think. That's why I think that in so many countries, the hard right, think about President Aznar in Spain, love to call themselves Democrats. Because if you're a perfect Democrat, then that's the end of the discussion. There's nothing else to say. All the blame is on the other side, and all they have to do is just to submit themselves, subject themselves to the rule of law in your own terms. President Santos had the courage to acknowledge that there might be some blame as well on the side of the Colombian state, and that acknowledgement, which necessarily is horizontal, is actually what made the negotiation possible. The second problem about peace and politics is the transition, as many people say, from arms to ballots. That is actually the heart, was the heart of the negotiation, or of any negotiation with a guerrilla. It's an exchange of weapons for political guarantees. If you are the government, you say, okay, you lay down your weapons, and we will give you guarantees for political participation. And from the point of view of the guerrilla force, that is actually what gives sense to the whole negotiation. The reason they negotiate is to tell themselves and their own people, we are doing this because we will now have no recourse to arms, we are going to defend our ideas democratically. We will tell them at the negotiation table. So this is actually the heart, this exchange is the heart of this or of any negotiation. But in the case of Colombia, I would submit it's even more important, because I really do think that no other democracy in modern times has suffered the levels of violence against elected officials that Colombia has suffered. Most people don't know this, but in the last 30 years, around, and these are the figures of the Centro de Memoria Histórica, about 1,500 mayors and local council members were either killed or kidnapped. 1,500. Now, under those conditions, no democracy can function. And you wonder, why is that? Well, that is because of the conflict, of strategies of territorial control on the part of the guerrillas and those of the paramilitary, and also, more often than not, because local politicians use the paramilitary or the guerrillas to get rid of their rivals. But it is the framework of the conflict that has allowed so much violence to be directed against elected officials, which I think is really a scandalous figure. And not just that, but as is well known, as of the late 80s, a whole political party, which was created by an agreement with the FARC in the 80s, the Unión Patriótica, was completely wiped out because of this political violence. So for us, the aim was not just simply to get the FARC to lay down their weapons and go into politics. The aim was to send a signal that we need to re-establish a rule, that we needed to enact cultural change and say, we no longer tolerate violence in our own democracy. At the same time, many studies show that political inclusion is the biggest guarantee of stability for peace. In a recent study by Charles Cole, he showed that of the major peace processes of the last 30 years, virtually all of those that had included measures of political inclusion had been successful and were stable, and vice versa, those who hadn't had failed. So whether you like it or not, you might not like it. Many Colombians don't like it, and I understand that. They don't like to see a former guerrilla sitting in Congress. But you have to think that guerrilla sitting in Congress is actually our best guarantee for the stability of peace. And in fact, Colombia is no exception, because we already had a history. What's very strange about our case is that we already had a history of political inclusion. Many of those guerrillas of the that demobilized in the early 90s, most famously now Gustavo Petro, who actually came number 2 in the previous elections, had been guerrillas who participated in politics. You wonder, okay, well, it wasn't a problem then, but it's intolerable now. What's the explanation? The point of the whole exercise, in the end, is, as President Chavez once told me in a meeting I had with him, that President Santos sent me to explain to him the peace process. He said, after President Santos had begun to change our relation with Venezuela, he said, you know, Sergio, formerly we used to treat each other as enemies, and now we're going to treat each other as adversaries. And in the end, that's what it's about. We fully disagree with you, but we're not out to destroy you. That's what you're trying to do. Still, we had formidable obstacles. We had this virulent opposition of former President Uribe to FARC's political participation, and the problem, which I'll go back to again, that without that political participation, the guerrilla have no narrative to which to justify their own peace effort and to convince their own people why this is all worth it. In the end, what we had to do, and we paid a very hefty price for, was to repoliticize the FARC. Clearly, by 2010, the FARC had a long history. It was a guerrilla. It had a political organization, but at the same time, it was involved in all kinds of activities that we all know about. But the peace process, what it allowed us to do was to repoliticize the FARC and to bring it into the fold, to bring it into the political process and to wrap up the conflict in what I think is a much more beneficial way to Colombian society than to keep on chasing them around the country as many had wished. And the way we did that, what I'm calling the repoliticization of the FARC, was first to establish the basic terms of this deal, or to write them into the framework agreement we negotiated during the secret talks in 2012, which included already the idea of disarmament. The FARC opposed it bitterly. It was actually the only time during the whole of the peace talks that the negotiations broke down, because I had to, when they refused to put this into the writing, we said, okay, we now know that you're not interested in ending the conflict, and we stood up and left, and they had second thoughts and wrote it in. But it wasn't just the idea of disarmament, it was the sequence which was also critical, which was to say, if you're going to participate in politics, then the condition is that you first have to disarm. The disarmament process has to start simultaneously with the signing of the final agreement. That condition we put into the framework agreement from the very beginning of the peace process. And on that basis, and with that guarantee, out of the framework agreement, which we call the general agreement and signed in August of 2012, then we moved on to include other items on the agenda, the ones I just mentioned. And later on, in the public phase of the peace talks, we started developing these political guarantees for the FARC. Very important, a whole system of protection for those who participate in politics, especially with their own history, but also various measures to facilitate the creation of a legal political party for them, finance for the political party, and even for the think tank, which many criticized, but that's what you want them to do, to be thinking about how to participate in democratic politics. And in particular, the guarantee of 5 seats in the Senate and 5 seats in the chamber, which, if you think about it, the total number of seats in the Colombian Congress, Senate and chamber is about, it's moved a bit, it's about 270 plus. So this is 10 seats out of that. But we didn't even give them the 10 seats. We applied what I used to call it in Habana, the strategy of the trapeze artist, meaning, like in a circus, you said, okay, so you go and you launch yourself, and you have to go and present yourself to the electorate, and if you're successful and you pass the threshold, then chapeau, then we don't have to give you anything. You caught the trapeze. If you don't, and you fall, then you have the guarantee of having 5 seats here and 5 seats there. Unfortunately, they sort of failed very badly, but fortunately, there was a net, so the political process moves on. With this guarantees that we gave them, came at least 3 types of obligations. First, naturally, disarmament. So you want to participate in the political process, you want to sit in Congress, then you have to disarm. And that is actually, in my view, the main explanation as to why the FARC disarmed against all predictions so incredibly quickly. The negotiation took about 4.5 years, and the FARC disarmed in about 6 months. And the reason why that happened so quickly, apart from our own pressure for them to disarm quickly, was that they knew that unless they disarmed quickly, they would miss the deadline of the next elections of 2018, and they would be out of the political game. So democracy worked there as a lever for peace to get the FARC to disarm quickly. Secondly, we gave them special guarantees to allow them to create a new political party, but with those guarantees come obligations that are attached, as with any political party. So if you incur in illicit finance of your party, or if you promote violence, for example, you are liable to lose your legal status as a party. So that's another guarantee. And finally, in terms of justice, which is a huge issue, in particular after a judgment of the Constitutional Court, all of those FARC members who may wish to participate in politics and become elected officials are still bound by their obligations to the transitional justice system in terms of truth, justice, and reparations, still have to go before the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, still have to go before the Truth Commission, if they call them, still have to answer to the Special Unit for the forcefully disappeared. That's what the Constitutional Court said. So that is an added guarantee for the victims. And I think that together, all those obligations do constitute a kind of bulwark of stability for the peace process. But the peace process was not just about the FARC's participation. And this is the third problem I wanted to address. The tension between the need to promote, in this transitional phase, greater pluralism in Colombian democracy, a more vigorous and even more radical, possibly, political debate that includes social protest as a way of channeling conflict. The contrast between that and the need to build trust and bring people together in a more deliberative approach to politics to create a shared vision of peace. If you want to oversimplify, you might say that it's a well-known contrast between a radical or between a robust or radical democratic debate and again a more deliberative approach that emphasizes shared interests. How do you mix those two? And the truth is, in the real world, the truth is that it's not either or. You need to do both at the same time. And the question is how? The agreement has a full chapter, which was the second agreement, on political participation, which has a whole range of measures to promote pluralism. For example, I'll enumerate a few quickly. It makes it easier to create political parties and to keep your legal status if you fall below the threshold, the vote threshold in an election. It orders the passing of a statute for the opposition. That's something that actually was already in the '91 Constitution. Governments had had about 10 goes at that always failed, and we actually now managed to do this last year. And in fact, it's already having effects in the debates that are happening in Congress. It ordered the creation of 60 new electoral districts for those regions hardest hit by the conflict, and especially for the victims, as a way to integrate these regions into the country, make them visible in the Colombian Congress, and also to send a signal of reparation and acknowledgement of what they had gone through. Unfortunately, we, the central government, failed to get this to Congress last year, and there was another go last few weeks without much enthusiasm that failed again. It establishes measures to make it easier for Colombians to vote in the great Colombian periphery. For example, a problem that not many people know about of the referendum or plebiscite is that many people wanted to vote, but it was too expensive to get to the voting booth because they had to get a little boat. They literally did not have the money. And the agreement also creates or suggests a number of guarantees, or to be more precise, the convening of a special forum to discuss. This was done last year, new guarantees for social movements and also for social protest. So all of these measures together should make for a healthier democratic debate. At the same time, the agreement is built on the idea of promoting citizens' participation in line with the spirit of the '91 Constitution, above and beyond what's in the political participation chapter. All the points of the agreement are shot through with references to participation. In particular, those that have to do with the rule reform. The idea is to start this participatory planning processes so that you actually not only just do the planning, but you activate the political rights of those Colombians in the periphery. You give them voice, and this is done by their participating in the 16, we call them in Spanish, PEDETs, which has no good translation, but it means literally rural development programs with a territorial approach. And this, in fact, is not just theory or dead letters on the page. Already about 150,000 people have participated in the making of these plans in their own regions. And the point, again, is not just simply to plan, but to break down the barriers of trust among citizens and between citizens and the state. And if you like, and if it sounds too ambitious, it is, to redefine the state-society relations in that Colombian periphery and to promote a new state-building model, which I have elsewhere called territorial peace. At one such meeting recently, in El Salado, which is a city in the north, in the Montes de Maria, where there was, as many of you may know, a terrible massacre 18 years ago, some representatives from social movements said the following, and I brought the quotes. I thought it was a good illustration. They said, you people from the ART, which is the agency in charge of organizing these meetings, they said, you people from the ART are very clever and are doing this on purpose. It is something we, the social movements and organizations, missed, to have a space, missed in the sense that we did not do, to have a space where we can all come together, do our own catharsis, fight over what happened, and reconcile ourselves in a joint exercise of thinking together about the future of our region. It is true, that's exactly what we had hoped would happen. And this we promoted not just at the village level, but more generally. The point is not just to have the local communities, but the regions and the provinces take charge of their own future. And this is where I've always insisted, and Antonio no doubt will talk about that the role, for example, of the private sector in the regions of Colombia is so important. This cannot be left just to the government. And in that spirit, we started various kinds of experiments. For example, a year ago, a bit over a year and a half ago perhaps, we started an experiment in Valledupar in the north of Colombia that has spread, which we called improbable dialogues. So what we did was, I had this idea together with Jean-Paul Lederac of Notre Dame, was convened key actors of society that normally would not talk to each other, bring them together in a room, confidentially, and around that hardcore of actors, get them to invite more and more people and get a discussion going among those people who normally would not talk to themselves, amongst themselves. And that's actually worked very well and has been replicated now in other parts of Colombia. The last, and I'll finish with this, the last problem I wanted to talk about in the relation between peace and politics is the great problem we had of how to negotiate an agreement far away in Habana under conditions of confidentiality, even though every time we reached an agreement we made it public. Still, the impression of Colombians is this is happening very far away in Habana and we don't know what's going on, despite our efforts to explain. So the challenge was how to do that negotiation and get the Colombian public to feel that it was their peace process. This was perhaps the biggest challenge of all. And we did a number of things. Every time we started to discuss a point in Havana, we would organize, with the help of the university and the National University and the UN, a big forum so people could bring proposals. We set up a virtual mailbox so people could send proposals. We did go, when we were in Colombia, around the country explaining what was going on, but obviously none of this was enough, which is how we, in the end, got to the idea of the referendum, of having a referendum on the agreement. It was not just an issue, it was also an issue, but it was not just an issue of democratic legitimacy, it was also an issue of participation, of giving the people the feeling that this was also theirs and they could appropriate it. Now, of course, things did not turn out that way, and you might think, well, what a very bad idea. And it is true that the effect was exactly the opposite, was to, instead of uniting the country, divided the country. But in a way, it was no surprise. I mean, something you can read up on the books that professors write and study referenda and tell you, well, this is what happens sometimes when you do a referendum, and that's exactly what happened in Colombia. I won't go into many the details of the campaign. Lots of all know what happened. I'll just point out that, as many of you know, it did have a striking similarity with Brexit. The kind of arguments that were used. It was said that we were going to hand over the country to the FARC. This clearly did not happen. It was said that we were going to turn Colombia into Venezuela. This clearly did not happen. It was said that we were going to corrupt children with an ideology of gender. To this day, I don't entirely understand what the expression means. But I can tell you this did not happen. We did not corrupt the children. And finally, it was said that we were promoting peace with impunity, especially by former President Uribe. Peace with impunity. In fact, we had agreed to the most, if I may be so immodest, really to the, by far the most comprehensive transitional justice program ever put into a peace agreement, which included or required the FARC to go up before a tribunal and acknowledge the wrong and the crimes it had committed, which no guerrilla had ever done before. So we did that most that could be done. And yet, recently, in a not entirely uncharacteristic move, the very former President Uribe actually proposed that instead of, as the agreement says, giving 20 years in prison for those who don't want to acknowledge responsibility, that we should move that to 5. And that's all that happens. And if you do that, which is what he was proposing in Congress, you completely blow up the system of incentives, because the incentives are you tell the truth and you go before the system and you go to the Truth Commission, you do all those things and you address the victims, then you can do this for 8 years. If you don't, you go for 20 years to prison. President Uribe was proposing, no, let's just have them not acknowledge responsibility and just do 5 years, which is the way to destroy the whole system. So much for his words about impunity. I say. What was different from Brexit in the Colombian plebiscite referendum was that it was never, in the end, a binary decision between leave and remain. Even those who opposed us said, yes, but. This is a yes, but. Former President Uribe is on the record saying, no, we don't want the negotiations to stop. We don't want the negotiating table to break down. We want modifications. So what did we do? What did President Santos do? Well, the first thing was acknowledge we lost, which he did, like any Democrat. And then sent us to Habana with Humberto de la Calle to talk to the FARC. They acknowledged it as well. And then we started talking to the no side intensively for October and the beginning of November. And at the end of that, we had put together with them a document of 60 items that they wanted changed in the agreement. And with that under our arms, we went up to Havana again, and in really what was an extraordinarily difficult negotiation, because from the FARC's point of view, everything they were going to do was make concessions to the government, but there was no other way out. We actually managed to get the great majority of the 60 items, 58 on my count, changed, except naturally for the issue of political participation. With that, we came back to Colombia, and sat with the representatives of no side, but unfortunately there was no agreement, and a great opportunity for reconciliation in Colombia and possibly unique was missed. And I think it was missed for two reasons. First, because of President Uribe's rejection of political participation, a consequence of his denial of the armed conflict, as I already said, without which the agreement was not possible. So if that's the basic condition, well, there's nothing you can do. But again, as I said at the beginning, also because the political project of the hard right in Colombia was to use the opposition to peace to get back into power. And unfortunately, that's what I saw myself that fateful night when we finally sat down with them, showed them or discussed the results of the renegotiation. Almost every single person sitting in front of us was a presidential candidate of the opposition. And I'm not joking. I can tell you how many there were, including the president and the vice president today. And it was obvious to me that even though in the corridors on the phone, some acknowledged that the changes had been made, that President Uribe had already made the decision, I'm not going to give away this political platform, I'm going to use this to get back into power, which is what he did. So what now? Where are we now? After the election, it looked like the peace agreement and Colombian politics had parted ways. But once in power, the new government has been more cautious. And we have to wait and see. Still, I think it's difficult to undertake such a massive peace-building effort without enthusiasm, and especially without a narrative. I think the new government has a major problem in that it does not really have a narrative that allows him to do what it probably even wants to do, but can't, because it cannot yet justify politically. So it tends to see the peace process in a very reductionist way as a DDR program or an alternative development program, and that's not what the agreement is. The agreement is what I already described. At the same time, the reality of peace is making itself felt on the ground. And Colombia is a different country. There are the demands of those tens of thousands I described that have participated in this planning processes. They're not going to go away. They're expecting these things to be done, to be implemented. There is a strong support and the close supervision of the international community, including the Security Council and the EU. And there's the appearance, as expected, of social movements, large social protests. The country is witnessing at the moment what we knew was going to happen if we signed an agreement, which was the largest student protests actually in living memory. And the government, as a consequence of all of that's going on, actually took a big dip, some of you may know, in its popularity of 27 points in 3 months. But if it is intelligent, sooner rather than later, it should realize that the peace agreement is the only shared language it has with those great masses in the Colombian periphery and with many of these ever more vocal social movements. So there is actually still a great opportunity there, and that is why in the end I remain an optimist about peace. Thank you very much.
We will now continue with a 45-minute panel discussion between Sergio Jaramillo and Antonio Celia, visiting professor in practice at the LSE's Latin American and Caribbean Center. Professor Celia is the former CEO of Promigas, one of the oldest private companies in the natural gas sector in Colombia. Through his various roles and positions, Professor Celia has played a key role in galvanizing private sector support for Colombia's historic peace agreement. His extensive experience is considered to be particularly relevant to the Center's Europe-Latin American Network on Violence, Security and Peace, working to generate research-based knowledge on the crisis of violence and security in Latin America. Our moderator, Jean-Paul Faguet, is Professor of Political Economy of Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He is also co-program director of the Masters in Development Management. Professor Faget's current work focuses on historical institutions, inequality, and long-term divergent development outcomes in Colombia and Latin America. With these exceptional profiles being described, please welcome Professor Celia and Professor Faget to the floor.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tatiana. Thanks to all of you for being here present with us tonight. Thank you to the Colombian Society and to my student Alvaro Acosta for organizing all of this event, and the other officials of the Colombian Society. Can I just say, as an LSE professor, I'm proud of you guys, and I'm very impressed that they've managed to put this together and to get Sergio Jaramillo to come and address us all tonight. It's a very interesting event. There's no one left outside who could come and take these 3 seats, is there? There were people waiting outside earlier, but okay. So I think we can go ahead and start. I had several questions, but in view of the late hour, we have this room until 7:30 or until 8? 8. Until 8, okay, all right, so we've got enough time. So I think I'll compress my questions into 2, and then we'll open up for a discussion to the floor, if that's all right. So my first question is, maybe we'll let Antonio speak first, but the question is really for the 2 of you, is I think one of the unusual, my second question is how does the Colombian agreement differ from other international experiences? But first of all, I think one important key thing here, which may be a point of similarity with South Africa, is the role of the business community. There's, I think, a very strong role of the business community, which is somewhat behind the scenes. From overseas, it's less apparent to us than it probably was to you in Colombia. So if you can describe a bit the role of the business community supporting this.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here, and it's an honor to be with my friend Sergio on the pod. It's a new life for me. I was a businessman for 35 years. Now I'm a PhD professor in practice, and I'm having a lot of fun learning a lot with reference. I want to begin saying this. I have had a long relationship with Sergio even when he was in Ideas for Peace. And once he told me to write certain comments regarding what should the peace process would look like. I forgot about that, and when President Santos was in Cartagena, just at the beginning of his mandate, I had dinner with him. And Sergio was there. And Sergio looked very suspicious. And President Santos told me, Antonio, what will you think if we start talking to FARC? I looked at Sergio, that was, suspicious face was still there. And I said, President Santos, I believe that we have been a little bit triumphalism. And I do believe that people think that we are winning this war. And that these guys are completely defeated, and that they will surrender soon. So I don't know whether people is perceiving that we should talk to FARC now. He told me, how about if I tell you that I have 2 very deep and comprehensive surveys that indicate that people do want a dialogue, negotiated exit of this conflict. And so they began to talk secretly with FARC, although I knew what was happening. So I, since the beginning, was convinced that we, the business community, need to support this process. But it was not very popular in the business community. Sergio knows this. It's not very frequent. I don't know why most of the businessmen are or Republicans or conservatives or Centro Democrático in Colombia. I don't know why. We're not too many of the Liberal Party. And then we start working. I also want to comment that my company, my group of companies, were one of the favorite, if not the favorite targets of FARC. We had 36 bomb attacks in 3.5 years. 9 of our people were kidnapped. So we suffer. We suffer very much in conflict. Recently, I gave a book to my friend Alexandra Bello, founder of the American Center, that you should read if you're interested in Colombian Congress. It's a book entitled El Líder del Bien by Alonso Sánchez Bauta. It's very interesting because he describes the parallel lives of both commanders, one of the paramilitares on the 40 and one of the FARC, who is imprisoned in the United States, Simon Trinidad. At some moment, I received calls from both of the groups threatening my company and our organization regarding the threats that we suffer from them. The fact is that a relatively small group of businessmen supported this process since the beginning, and through the Consejo Privado de Competitividad, at that moment I had that chair, we reached an agreement with EAFIT, University of Medellin, a very well-reputed private institution in Medellin, to follow up the process. And Sergio was very, very generous. Every 15 days, every time he came from Habana, he went to Medellin or to Bogota, and to this very small group, gave us a report on what was happening. And that was very important for us because we knew what was happening, and we were supporting, since the private perspective, the whole process. Why this is important, and I emphasize this importance after a conversation that I had with Ian Shapiro, who did this in LSE. Ian Shapiro was a key actor. He's a professor at Yale University, a key actor in the peace process in South Africa. Because at the end of the day, you need the economy to work much better. You need the economy to absorb the people. You need the economy to create jobs. You need the economy to be more dynamic. So you need to take certain decisions in the perspective of economic efficiency. Of course, there is a lot of social containing of this tension, but what you were mentioning, the productive project, deals with that. You are going to give the opportunity to many people that never had the opportunity to work and have an income from those jobs. So you need to know what the basics of the economy is. You need to know the basics of the market economy. You need to offer employment. You need to put money. You need to invest. So that's why, in very utilitarian terms, it is important the business community, and because you need to have validity of all the society of this process. And I thought there that we were a minority, but a very convinced minority, that this was the most important topic for Colombia in many years.
Did they listen to you, Antonio? Can you see, now I don't mean that in a personal way, can you see business criteria or ideas about growth in the economy reflected in the...
Not much of this is not for this process itself, Jean Paul. It's because I do think that one of the challenges that democracies, modern democracies have is to make the state more effective. Our state is not effective. It's irregular. It works well in some cases. It doesn't work in some cases. Let's put an example in Colombia. We need it, and we knew that once FARC was out of these regions, we need to establish presence of the state in all matters, in all these manifestations, in those areas. And we didn't do a good job, even though we knew that was very important. So we need to improve the efficiency of the state. And that's a pending work that most of the democracies have. I don't think that, when we talk about the crisis of democracy, I think it has to deal with a lot of expectations that are not being fulfilled in the timing that people expected. Why? Because the state is not capable of delivering at time and efficiency all the public needs that they require.
Right. Yeah, Sergio.
Can I just say quick?
Yes.
I disagree a little bit on one point on the private sector, because I think that what I saw, this is obviously an issue of perspective, and believe Antonio, not me, because he does this much better. But in my view, we actually had quite strong support from the private sector through most of the negotiations. For example, at the beginning when we were doing the secret talks, which were extremely difficult to do because they were secret. And so we could not have any recourse to you could not say, oh, to the presidency of the Republic where I worked, give me a ticket to go this, or I need a per diem for this, or we need to pay. We couldn't. We had to either get it out of our own pockets, or for certain special things, ask for some people to help us. And without actually the help of a number of businessmen, we could have never have got this done. Just to give just one simple example. And on the whole, you know, there are always skeptics and divisions in society, but on the whole, I always found those businessmen with whom I spoke, including those who disliked President Santos, who were always very respectful, and the meetings that Antonio described were always very serious. The big difference, and this is the point I wanted to make, came with the referendum, the plebiscite. Because after that, there was a complete change. And everyone kind of got very scared that if they were seen as being too pro-peace, then those who are against would punish them, even commercially. You know, I have an insurance company, I have a bank. I used to go with you and sit in a theater and talk about this, but now, no thanks, because I'm going to lose half my clients. This was the effect of the referendum.
It's a very interesting issue, because among other things, I was in charge of fundraising for the yes. And I know that the no got almost double the money.
That's a more specific answer than I was expecting. That's quite good. Thank you for that. I wanted to ask you, in a broader sense, about the underlying politics then. What effect did, we've already spoken to this, but if you can both expand your answers a bit more, what was the effect of business participation on both sides to the underlying politics of building the peace now, which is the challenge right now in Colombia?
From the point of view of the negotiation itself, a quick word, because I think in Colombia you have to distinguish between businessmen, if Antonio allows, and what are called in Colombia gremios, which are, you know, sounds like business associations, but in fact they're just lobbyists. In my view, they're private sector politicians. So if you look at the agreement on the whole, for example, the issue of rural development, our own Minister of Agriculture then, who was supervising that chapter, and who was himself a member of the Conservative Party, when I used to show him the draft agreements that we had reached in confidence in Habana, he would laugh and say, Sergio, you negotiated this with the FARC, with De La Calle and the others. This looks like a World Bank document. It was like absolutely by the book, standard rural development, nothing strange, funny, no. So, on the other hand, if the people who are the more vociferous members of the, let's say not the private sector, but of these gremios, especially on the land issue, were very opposed, because they unfortunately, they really do represent very ingrained interests that have no interest in there is everyone knows there's a great problem in Colombia of land concentration. You don't need to be a socialist to think that. I mean, we have one of the worst distributions of land on the planet, and this has very serious consequences for productivity. And it's not very difficult to think about ways, modern ways, which even our own Ministry of Agriculture, who was a conservative, promoted. But there was this kind of hardcore of very loud voices that were against. And those were the ones who were heard in public the most. And we're saying, oh, they're going to take the land away from us. There was not a single thing in the whole agreement that suggested we're going to take land away from anybody. But they wanted to go back to this kind of 1960s rhetoric, which is not what we're doing.
I have to say that in general, the government was very generous in listening to our proposals. And we always, and that's my perspective, I have certain bias, they always listen to us. We always make some warnings on certain topics that we didn't like. But Capítulo de Tierras was even better in terms of private investment than what Polo Democrático was proposing. Even today, Polo Democrático doesn't agree with that. So that means that how come Polo Democrático, the left party, doesn't agree with FARC in the sense that opening the land investment options for Colombian projects. And the other thing that I believe, and this is not loud, now that I'm a professor in practice, I have to be very careful what I say. That's what they tell me here, told me here. No, the thing is, after 50 years in conflict, I was talking to your friend Nick over there. What happened was that many members of the business community, because of that very complicated and terrible conflict, turned right in terms of the political position. Many of them turned right. That's my perception. Another thing that happened is that clearly, and there's a very good book on that by Jorge Hidalgo from Yafit, Ideas en la Guerra, Ideas in War, is that FARC had many opportunities to enter into peace process, and they didn't take advantage of those opportunities. So they took too long, 50 years. So what happens is that they're not a political option now. And M19, they did it on time, and they have now a reward, most likely the next maybe Bogota, or Petro, and many others. So that also complicated the whole history, the position of the business community and many other people in Colombia. And in the next intervention, I'll confirm what Sergio said with a very vivid experience that I had in the conversation with people of Centro Democrático, why they didn't accept our proposals to reach an agreement, which is very interesting. And now I think after 1 year I can open certain secrets.
Okay, I wanted to ask one more question, Bayan, before we open up to the floor. I think that there's a lot of interest in asking you guys questions directly. But I wanted to ask you, what is different or interesting about the Colombian agreement with comparison to other countries like South Africa, Northern Ireland, and this country, Mozambique, and other experiences that you know about? Because the Colombian one is, well, any agreement is particular. What is particularly interesting about the Colombian one? You mentioned the transitional piece.
I'm not the best person to ask, but anyway, you need somebody who has more of a view from the outside. But I would say, well, we had, in terms of process, we had failed so many times. There have been 3 major failed peace processes, and at such a high cost for the country that we really had to be very careful and follow what I called a strategy of prudence, of really taking one step at a time and going through these very elaborate secret talks and agreeing to a very clear framework before we went public. And even though there have been secret talks in other places, in South Africa there were secret talks, I think they were not as structured. And that actually worked extremely well. I think the whole thing would not have worked because the FARC would not have agreed to a number of things they did agree to if the whole discussion was already out in the public sphere. I think the issue of victims was a Colombian innovation, that we insisted on having a point on victims in the agreement, and that we brought victims to Havana to speak before the negotiating teams, that the government and the FARC. We had, as some of you may know, 60 victims that came in 5 groups of 12 over a period of about 3 months to address negotiations. So it's like a kind of live truth commission in the middle of a negotiation. And that really gave great, if I may say so, I think it gave great moral strength to what we're doing. And in the end, we did agree to what I think is the most ambitious transitional justice program, possibly too ambitious, that actually tries to do the impossible, the squaring of the circle, which is how do you match justice, peace, and political participation. where so many have failed over the last, think of Uganda, so many have failed over the last 20 years?
Yes, it's when we enter in discussion with our colleagues in the business community, people that we have been together for many years, but in this case we were thinking different, we were in a different position, is that we always will have discussion on this because it's a very difficult fine-tuning, a difficult trade-off between justice and peace. How much justice, how much peace. What I was going to say also is that my colleagues in the business community, they were afraid of three main things. They didn't like the three things. They wanted physical prison for these persons. They didn't like political communication. It was awful incident in the Congress. And they were very afraid of the special justice going after certain members of the business community that were really victims, and because of threats and blackmail by even FARC or paramilitary Spain. So those were like the three main concerns that they had. And the other story that I wanted to share with you, because I think it was very interesting and demonstrate how open and generous politically was this government regarding the process, Sergio Humberto and President Santos. At some moment when this was, going well and advancing, many people had conversation with President Santos, and the issue of talking to Centro Democrático, trying to reach an agreement on them was very important. And well, we cannot go ahead. We better have the opposition on our side to go ahead. And then he decided that a group of friends, business community also, had conversation with the representative of Central Democratic. Personally, I spent hours talking to Iván Duque, Carlos Holmes, Carlos Enrique Moreno, and some other persons that represented the opposition.
Another government, you may explain.
Huh?
And another government, you may explain.
Yes, Iván Duque, President Colombia. President Santos accepted at that moment, with the idea of getting an agreement with the opposition, to reveal those famous 75 points that at that moment were the points that were accepted or really agreed. But they were secret. And when we told him that we were in these conversations and they were going seriously, he said, okay. Yacir Reyes, one of the legal counselor of the process, went to the meeting with the 75 points, and we read one by one, and we discussed one by one of the 75 points. 6 p.m., we were almost in the same page. As a matter of fact, I went personally to Humberto de la Calle office around the Logal when we met, saying this is very close. 2 hours later, there was a press release which from Centro Democrático saying we do not agree at all with clearly, and this is, I'm not saying anything different to this, understandable. For them it was better to do politics and win elections with this platform. Exactly, I'm telling Nick that, exactly what Sergio said. And this is what happened. We had a liberal Democrat government, and then we went the other way to the right part of the political. And the other thing that we have been doing, and this is very important in my opinion, and again with all the approvals and the agreements and the support of the government, we created what we call a Consejo Empresarial por una Paz Sostenible. That means this is a business, it's a private council where we have business people, think tanks, Ideas por la Paz, and many others. We meet every 15 days to follow up the process. And the person in charge of this link with the government to see what, how the implementation was working was Frank Perry. one of his partners in Habana. So the think tanks of the business community, part of it is still very interested in following what is happening with implementation, which is very important. And among other things, it's going better than people think. We were in a meeting at the left with the Kroc Institute 50 days ago. They gave us a report. And I mean, it's complex, difficult, but I mean, we're there.
Okay. Why don't we open to questions from the floor? I think there are roving microphones. Yeah. Okay, we've got one or two roving microphones. Let me say one thing very briefly. We were scheduled to end now. If there are people who have to leave, perhaps you can make your way out quickly now, and then we'll continue. Feel free to get up and go. Don't feel obliged. Thank you very much for coming. And okay, why don't we start here with a question, and then we'll take here and there. Yeah, and then we'll take them three at a time and rounds. And if you could tell us who you are.
Yeah, Rita del Curto.
Is it on?
No. Okay, my name is Rita del Curto. I have an observation for Dr. Jaramillo and a question. So, first of all, I'm not sure if you can just say it was that President Uribe just had a political issue with Santos. I think it was more philosophical, which I'm sure you can appreciate, because from the beginning to hold the peace accord in Cuba, a country that is not a democracy, that has more than 100 dissidents in jail, was making a mockery of Colombia, a country that has the longest tradition of democracy in South America. And also, it was a bit ironic because in cabinet meetings with Uribe, the person who most lambasted Hugo Chavez in the meetings was Santos. You know, so it was interesting for him to flip sides when he became president. But on to my question, I just wanted to know if you can comment on, just how the peace accord has been doing, because since, a year, the production of illegal crops has tripled. There's been more than 100 murders or assassinations of the human rights activists. And also, I think it was the University of Notre Dame that said that only 30% of the accord has actually been implemented. And if you could just comment on that, please.
Let's take several together. There's another one here, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Andrei Gomez. I'm a research associate at UCL Institute of the Americas. Actually, I want to make a comment that it goes in the opposite way. Because I think that, Sergio, the problem was not even political or philosophical. The problem was the structural reform that the country needs. That is what you call territorial peace. And that's what Uribe and a sector behind Uribe was against and is still against. So I think that's where the main problem is. Now, that said, I would like to just ask you very quickly, or put on the floor 3 questions. First, I remember Rolf Mayer coming to Colombia 3 months before the plebiscite and saying, you are going to fail the plebiscite, you're going to lose it. And the reason why is because the electoral machine, the politics, is not working. And he was very surprised to see the attitude of many politicians in government not supporting the peace process. So that's the first thing. The second thing, in terms of the media as a conglomerate was very negative against the peace process. Let's remember the role that RCN played. So in a way, that was a sector of the business, one part of the business sector that did not engage with it. And the final thing that I probably want to put on the table is that you mentioned something very important. You said we try to repoliticize the FARC. But overall, there was a sense of lack of empathy for the FARC on the side of the Colombian government. And the only video that I've seen where there is a bit of a smiles between the president and Timoshenko and some of the team is in the new video that was released this week by Margarita Martinez that is called La Negociación. And many people claim that you were very strict in the negotiations, that you didn't let the teams get close to try to show the human side. Was that probably something that should have been done differently? Thank you.
One last over here.
Thank you. My name is Arturo Montejo. I'm a medical doctor, a family physician from Colombia, now studying a master's degree between LSHTM and LSE, Health Policy, Planning and Financing. First of all, as a Colombian, I just want to say thanks to Sergio Jaramillo for your efforts. Was like just with this work, really many of the young population just appreciate that effort. And my question is for Sergio specifically, what do you think is the most important challenge in the implementation of the Colombian peace agreement, especially in the rural communities? Because actually we can notice like a gap implementation between the theory and the practice. So it's quite related with that question.
Good, thank you. That's very good. Sorry, where did you start?
Okay, well, Rita, thank you for your question. No, I don't think. I mean, I agree with you. It's not just a political difference; it's a philosophical difference. Which I tried to explain, which is President Trujillo's denial that there's a conflict in Colombia and everything that derives from that, and the reason for that, which I also tried to explain. But with regard to Cuba and his ideological problems with Cuba, well, they're actually not so great because he actually ran a peace process himself in Cuba with the ELN between 2005 and 2007. The Uribe government had the ELN in Cuba for 2 years with dozens of NGOs going up and down. So I don't think he had such problems with Cuba then. But President Uribe is a different person now as he was then as president, unfortunately. But you are right that the two issues you mentioned are the most serious issues we're facing. That question, which is the growth of the coca fields and the violence. Colombia is in this extraordinarily paradoxical situation that the murder rate is at its lowest in about 40 years, but there are pockets of violence where a lot of social leaders and human rights activists precisely in these transitional regions are getting killed, and the government, neither in the Santos government nor the current government, has had an adequate response for that. And that is true, and that is very serious, and we had the Special Rapporteur of the UN in Colombia very recently, just last week, and he said there's nowhere else in the world where this is happening. And there is some of a mea culpa there, because it didn't need much foresight to realize that once the FARC disarmed, we're going to have a problem. And I think the Colombian state and we all were too slow. So you're right about that. On Andre's point on what Rolf Mayer said, that's also entirely right. And that is, I think, a major mistake that was made by us of the Yes campaign, but if I may say so, especially by those responsible of running that campaign. We were part of that campaign with Humberto de la Calle, but we were explaining the agreement to Colombians, not on the umbrella of the Yes campaign, but of negotiators, was to think that this was an ordinary political campaign and to use the usual channels and mechanisms through which regional politicians move their voters. And that had a number of problems. First, that a number of those regional politicians were actually not very interested. They were not going to get people to move because perhaps some of the businessmen, in the end, they were not really convinced. And also, a major mistake I think that was done by the campaign, and by the government, and by us, was to send the wrong signal. And I saw this very often in many places I went to, especially in the hardest hit areas, which was, why are you sending us the standard old politicians who talk about peace. Why are you not working directly with us, the organizations that are on the ground, who actually care about this, and why don't you use us and mobilize us instead of thinking that this is that is actually a very, I think, history will show is true and will be harsh on us and those responsible for the Yes campaign. And on the FARC and empathy, I have there a slightly different view. I do think that the FARC is to a large extent responsible for Colombians not having more empathy, because they had plenty of opportunity over the whole time in Habana to do more things to show Colombians that they were really going to change. They did, but late in the game. There were some very impressive examples, but there were few. Going to Bojayá and Chocó and acknowledging responsibility, going to Cali as Pablo Catatumbo did and standing before the victims of kidnapping and acknowledging responsibility, that was good. But if that had happened not in late 2016, but it had happened 2 years before, and Colombians had seen them as being less arrogant, I think they would have had a different opinion. So I think most of the blame there, in my view, is on the FARC. And anecdotally, on the being too strict, well, I couldn't be too strict because I couldn't manage everyone. But the truth is that what we were was formal. And I think this is the sign that it was a real negotiation. If you're in a real negotiation, that is not about being charming or because the issues are too serious. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't find ways and means, which I had myself, with at least 2 of the major FARC managers. I would meet them on the side, outside, and we would exchange notes and we would see what's going on. But the actual negotiation was a real negotiation. And in a real negotiation, it's not the place to be sitting down, drinking whiskey and knowing is you are actually deciding. That's actually what happened in the past. In the Pastrana government, the government toured Europe for 2 months. This is something that's unbelievable. 2 months staying in hotels in Europe and seeing how democracy works in Sweden. And this is not a joke, this is true. And we knew that Colombians wouldn't tolerate that. So we're actually also extra careful. I want to send that signal again.
I want to mention or remember that the implementation is very complicated. Without any doubt. The agreement itself is complex. It's 100 pages. I mean, you have many possibilities of failing in certain topics. And what we require, another thing, is something that you know more than everybody here in Japan, is regional capabilities. We have to build regional capabilities. It's a country of regions, and we need to establish certain abilities and capabilities in different regions to have a good implementation. When I said that my businessmen colleagues didn't agree with us, I'm not blaming. I'm not saying. I mean, what I want to mention is, or to remark, is that they were convinced about it. They were convinced about it. I thought we had the ability to convince them of our ideas, that it was worth for the country to this trade. But I'm not saying that it was a political, philosophical position. That's what they think. That's what they still believe. And the other thing that I feel I perceive it happens is that in some cases with this Consejo Empresarial, where we are following up with diaspora past and all the think tanks that are really specialized in these topics, it's not easy to convince the government to give you documentation regarding implementation. Public sector tend to be jealous and suspicious of the private sector in general. So it's a very difficult job. The referendum, I think different from what you both mentioned. If you put it in a game theory, rational perspective, the decision was more rational than you believe it was. What was the fallback if you voted no? There was no war. The fallback was no back to war. And the government and FARC were both very honest in saying, if the no wins, we won't go back to the no. We won't go back to the war again. When I had the opportunity to meet Jonathan Powell a couple of times because in Second House, and I keep talking to him. Jonathan Powell was the chief candidate when he's with the island. And we were talking, and he mentioned that when that happens, a week before, they're still having war in the cities, war in everywhere, bombs. So this is terrible to mention, but people at the end of the journey thought, if I have an agreement which is not perfect. If I say no, there is an opportunity to improve the agreement. But we're not going back to terror. And that was happening. First of all. Second, maquinarias políticas do not work in this case. This is a very opinion vote, like for president. You don't move maquinarias for this type of decision. I know referendums and plebiscito, and we know now better than before, that are very emotional. Very emotional. But in this case, again, what you had was, I was very concerned about this. This comment, this possibility, I mentioned with my friends 3 weeks before. It was not a matter of telling the local politician, go and tell them and convince them the benefits of peace. No. It was, what do I have? And that was happening. I mean, of course, I remember that day. I felt like, I don't know, Patricia, we were so sad that it was not surprising. Then we tried to renegotiate again, and we had 3 meetings with Centro Democrático representative. But I think that was, in my opinion, that was what happened. The other thing is that at the end, almost at the end of the process, President Santos commissioned 6 members of the business community to go to Habana to talk very frankly with FARC. We had a very frank conversation with Sergio, and mainly two issues we remark. First, don't be too arrogant. Don't be too arrogant. You have to understand that you're not negotiating with the government. You're not negotiating with us. We're supporting this, and this is a tough job for us. We're not very popular because of this. Many people told us communists. We became communists. And then the thing is, you are negotiating with the society. You are negotiating with a hard country. You have to understand that. Don't be arrogant. And the second is, the model, development model, is not in jeopardy. It's not in discussion. This is liberal democracy. I mean, it's capitalism, market economy. So you have to understand that. And they were very, very open. Very, of course, they were in the plan of being nice to us. So that was a good conversation, but very frank, very direct. And one of the main issues that we remarked in that conversation was don't be so arrogant because you're not negotiating with the government. This is not. You have to convince the whole society that this is worth.
Good, thank you both. We have about 10 minutes left, so let's take some more questions. Could I ask you to be brief and go directly to your question as a courtesy to each other? So let's start at the other extreme if we can, and then here, and then there. So in the purple sweater backwards. Tell us who you are, and then a brief question. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Roberto Perez. I graduated from Rosario University, Universidad de Rosario in Bogota, Colombia. I studied jurisprudencia, and now I'm pursuing my second bachelor degree in business administration at Hull International Business School. First of all, I want to thank the organization, all the Colombian Society for organizing this space, which is amazing, and I truly, truly love. And well, my question appeals more to the human side. In many repetitive occasions, I've heard that the peace agreement is secondary to actually constructing and to building a peace environment in Colombia. I want to ask you, where do you think actually building this peace environment starts? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And just here, please, in the blue jacket.
Thank you. Well, my question is for Mr. Celia. Well, for the Colombian society and for the victims, it's really important to know the version of the story from the business community, because, as is well known, some businessmen were not only victims, as you said, but also they took part of some of the crimes that were committed during the armed conflict. The question is, do you think it's how do you think is the best way to call the business community or some specific businessmen into the jurisdiction of the Truth Commission or the Special Jurisdiction for Peace without affecting the companies and in general the Colombian economy?
Thank you. And the light blue shirt over here, I don't know if you can pass the microphone over. Lovely, thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Omar. I'm a PhD candidate here at the school at the Department of Government. My question for Mr. Jaramillo is about the ALN. So, why do you think that they didn't actually jump on the boat of the peace, so to speak? Why didn't they realize that the Santos government was a short opportunity, a short window to get a fair deal, so to speak? Thank you.
Good. Three very direct questions. Would you like to start?
Yes, on the first one of the peace building environment, what occurs to me is that if you can make a I don't think it's a question of saying let's do peace, let's not do the peace agreement, but I do think you can at least conceptually distinguish between, let's say, substance and procedure, by which I mean I think that in order to get a peace, what you call a peace-building environment going, it's important to establish procedures that allow people to participate. To give you an example, I mentioned that during the negotiation we would convene through the UN and the National University of Colombia a great big forum so people could come to it and send proposals to Habana. The first one was on rural development and land issues, which were very sensitive. And some businessmen were not sure they should go. They were scared of the social movements, but they did go. And the reports, because we didn't go ourselves, we were in Habana, and the point was not for us to be there, was that these were extremely civilized discussions where people realized, who normally are loggerheads with each other, they realized they could actually have a civilized and serious discussion about an issue of shared interest, such as rural development and land. So I think that, and I mentioned an example of this thing we started about a year ago that we called the improbable dialogues. That's what should happen. In fact, I think that's what the government should do. The government says that it's promoting this idea of a national pact, but it's not inviting anybody to participate in this pact that's not a friend of theirs. So it doesn't look like much of a pact if it's not with your adversaries. I think establishing procedures where people can see that they can actually participate and they're respected and that all the opinions are taken into account is not just the way to build a peace-building environment, but the way out of the current political situation.
That's a very difficult question. I wouldn't know how to answer. Two comments I have is Comisión de la Verdad doesn't have effective judicial effects. And what you really, as a Colombian, what you want is that someone tell you really what happened in a very say, objective, if that is possible way. And special justice has incentives, built-in incentives for people to say what really happened. And when you look for here is justice and truth. And in the case of the victim, one of the most important things that Sergio, we have to mention is that this process, the center of the process is the victims in Colombia. This is the center of the process. This makes a difference for us. That is why we want. And ley de víctimas, reparación de tierra, reparación, restitución de tierra, those are mechanisms that will help to reconciliation. But it's not easy.
Do you have anything to say about the ELM?
Oh, the ELM. Well, that's a very difficult question. In the end, in a way, a peace process is often less about a negotiation and more about consolidating a decision. And the negotiation, what it does, it creates an environment where this decision can be taken. And the FARC, when we started, was already reflecting on this seriously. The ELN much less so. That's the first thing I would mention. Secondly, it's very well known that the ELN have a completely different structure and very great difficulties of command and control. And thirdly, I think we as a government, if you ask me, made the mistake of turning the ELN negotiations public too quickly. Even though they had already been going on for quite a long time, the sort of what was supposed to be the secret phase, it became public too quickly without a solid previous agreement as we had with the FARC. So it was, what came out was, as most people would say, a kind of vague and general thing that sent very mixed signals and did not give anybody really the reins on the process to move this forward. But that said, I think that, and also, I mean, there's a big discussion, of course, because the ELN and the FARC are very different organizations, or were. That said, my own view was that the more we move forward and succeed with implementation on the ground, and that real changes happen, the more likely it is that the ELN will take this seriously. I've often thought that with the ELN, it's not just about talking to the ELN, it's about creating an environment where the ELN notices that it's at risk of losing its own communities, because the government is actually doing what the agreement says it should do, which is to work with the communities and do all these projects we described and get them involved and build these plans and actually do things. And so that's what we need. We need the government to implement the agreement if we want to make progress with the ELN.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're 28 minutes over our allotted time, so I think I'm going to draw to a close there. This has been an extraordinary insight and fascinating into something that we didn't know that much about. So please join me in thanking our two speakers.